Subscribe tribe, internet fans, soon to be new internet fans. Welcome. You are cordially invited to a cool and calm and collected sit down with me, your host of whatever this is. Whatever it might be, it's essentially a little book project. I'm going to do a book project. And why am I doing that? Why am I doing a book project? Truth be told, I'm doing a book project because I think it's important. Not because I have some sort of contrived opinion about books and their role in society and how they compare to other media containing narratives and information. Whether it's on the internet or from a way long time ago or something like that. It's not really that interesting to me in terms of categorizing, but I do enjoy intellectual content on the YouTube. And so I thought I was going to chime into the debate and talk about some intellectual stuff that touches me, which will serve as the fundament for a type of book club initiative where we will be discussing literature and stuff like this. Because you gotta discuss something, okay? And the relationship sex genre has already been occupied. So if we're not going to talk about money, if we're not going to talk about P-word, to quote a great YouTube intellectual, then there's only just interesting stuff left to talk about. And that could, for instance, be a book, right? Okay, cool. Elementary school lesson. I want to talk about this, specifically the title. Now I know what you're thinking. That's some philosophical mumbo jumbo. That's some weird meta-perspective tome attempting to rationalize every aspect of life, but really just ending up becoming rather contrived and confusing. You know, some pale, male, and stale buster from the past trying to tell us something we don't already know. Well, I wholeheartedly agree with taking that stance on a lot of writers in general. But as a lover of philosophy, and as a person who has enjoyed reading, albeit it's not something I do obsessively, which probably makes the viewer wonder, well, why has he put himself in this position to begin with then, of being the authoritative figure talking upon deep and profound subjects, if he's not some sort of obsessive mothman who dedicates his time to logging every single word of every single piece of wisdom of every tome out there and presenting for you a beautiful mosaic of stuff that never really concludes with anything. Of course, I'm not trying to say that I'm here to make some sort of grand conclusion from it all, because words do not suffice. But but I want to communicate about this type of stuff in a different way than has already been established on internet. And why do I want that? Why do I want to communicate in a different way? Well, it just so happens that I think that a lot of discussions are ruined by the way they are being had. And as such, perhaps this little series right here and my little attempt at doing something constructive as opposed to destructive for a change when it comes to using my faculties and my phone camera, because I'm already quite familiar with the lonely selfie video format, but I'm not gonna lie to you guys, the private side of my channel is full of well, some of it you might call brain damage, some of it you might call pure distilled schizophrenia, and some of it you might just call straight up comedy, straight up funny podcast comedy. But yeah, on here, on this stuff which is going to be published in real life, I'm of course much less retarded, I like to think. But I have to be a little bit filtered. You know, maybe I've already shot myself in the foot by saying the word retarded, you know, in case it's been added to the list of banned words, the ever-growing list of banned words, which I believe there was an intellectual movement to make it illegal to call someone retarded, which I guess kind of makes sense because you know, I watched a documentary from the 50s about people who had been diagnosed with mental retardation, and it's not very funny for the people involved, you know. The sort of South Park humor, haha retard, which I myself also profess. I can see how that could be perceived as hurtful by people who are retarded or have to live with retards all day. What are you, retarded? To quote the great Norm Macdonald, one of his best bits, one of his finest bits, asking if you're retarded. Now, Macdonald is a lover of Russian literature, and Russian literature is tightly connected to the more general European intellectual tradition and the field of psychology, but also philosophy and the great movement of the 20th century within European contemporary philosophy was of course existentialism, which is like a cool trifecta of Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Kierkegaard, combined with the increasing advancedness of natural science, to create essentially the understanding of human being that we operate with in common discourse today. The individual, the idea of the individual, and you know, Heidegger is is not categorized by the literature as an existentialist. He's categorized as a phenomenologist, which is usually dismissed as a kind of like weird, grasping too far branch of philosophy that nobody can really explain, but everyone loves saying the word phenomena. And it's really lent itself to become the springboard for an insane amount of different types of thinking and studies of the phenomenon, which really is a word that can be used to describe anything and everything. So some people tend to just scratch their head as soon as the word is mentioned, realizing that there is going to abound some confusion as the people speaking will be attempting to verbally stare at their own eyeballs without a mirror. Or something like that, if you need a cool poetic metaphor. Phenomenology wants to take philosophy a step further than just affirming being. It wishes to understand being. Now, I'm no big city fancy pants university school tutor. Okay, I went to uni. I studied some philosophy. I studied the arts, as some would say. And I did okay in it. I'm not some sort of freak of nature student either. Just to cast more doubt upon my qualifications as the authority speaking figure. But I don't really believe that you need to be schooled in order to have competency within stuff that isn't hard science. To me, philosophy has always been more about different ways of thinking than simply having a large vocabulary of words and memorized associations between all the different figures, all the different characters of the world, the philosophical world. I believe that a person can I believe that a person can really understand philosophical ideas without reproducing them in the exact wording of the author. And like a lot of so-called analytic philosophers will point out, a lot of disputes in meaning of concepts are really disputes about linguistic ambiguities rather than about logical content. Although, to draw an either-or distinction like that might also be too simple, because you have those that deny the existence of logical content altogether, as in content that is logical by virtue of itself, and not simply by virtue of the social context or dominating power structure, which is the type of academic thinking that has been born out of the combination of phenomenology with activist politics and Marxism. And that brings us to an interesting paradox about Heidegger. which is that he was alive in the 30s, and he was German. Which means that he happened to be alive and doing his thing on the academic scene at the same time as the rise of Adolf Hitler. And I'm not a historian, so I've not carefully studied the biography of Heidegger, so I don't know the details of his political decision making throughout his life in terms of aligning himself. But I do know that he was a part of the Nazi movement, and that he has been criticized for this. Strangely enough, by the successors to his phenomenology. Of course, when speaking of phenomenology, you have to mention Heidegger's teacher, Husserl, who was Jewish and I think was pushed out of influential position at the university where Heidegger was working due to the regime change. And so I'm not really making the case that phenomenology is inherently connected with that ideology. But Heidegger's name has certainly been connected heavily with that ideology and made it more palatable for people to focus on studying other writers, later writers. Among the most popular writers in contemporary philosophy today, you find the European continentals, the critics, many of which will be reliant upon the legacy of the French interpretation of phenomenology by Foucault. And this is the intellectual tradition that is supports social justice culture. The combination of the 1968 social revolution and philosophy, the philosophical movements of the 20th century, created essentially what we today call the woke left. But it's interesting that both the French post-structuralists and Heidegger kind of share a motivation of attempting to reach a higher purity of concepts in the way that they are described. This idea that a phenomenon can be described in a completely non-judgmental way, for instance, is kind of like the holy grail of phenomenological studies, in which one assumes that one can conduct an analysis of a concept, unifying the analyzed concept and the person analyzing the concept in a way that is logical beyond merely being subjective. I.e., a sort of generalized science of describing your own emotions. describing your own emotions. And, you know, the intellectual production that has come in the wake of phenomenology has been hugely contributing to the contemporary idea of psychological therapy and psychological conversations. To take an experience of something in your life and treat it as a thing and attempt to describe it in as value neutral terms as possible is what the essence of phenomenology is. And so a lot of the people who don't necessarily sympathize with philosophy from the get-go, for obvious reasons that it overthinks, they are right to point this out. Because, you know, if you're having normal functional conversations, it usually is better for everyone involved to try to describe their experiences in as neutral and intelligible terms as possible, especially if said conversation has the purpose of doing something. Now, this idea of doing something is very central to understanding Heidegger, and it's the anchoring that makes his philosophy reverberate all the way back to what the Western canon describes as the origins of philosophy, being the ancient Greeks. Now, I'm aware of Eurocentrism, and so I'm not here to argue that the ancient Greeks were the first to do philosophy, because everyone can do philosophy while they're waiting for the bus. They might do it on accident even. It just never gets spoken about. But things are what they are. If you work from within the university tradition, especially in Europe, but seeing as the institution is so shaped by Europeanism, then, you know, even globally, most higher educational institutions will be to some degree Eurocentric, if you want to take a really critical view. But it might make it easier for people who are interested in philosophy to understand how Heidegger fits in to the greater development that we can only describe as the phenomenon of Europe. And you know, that's helpful for both people who are very upset about Eurocentrism and people who approve of Eurocentrism, who are kind of more traditionalists. So both for radicals and traditionalists, it's good to have a integrated understanding of the movement within thinking, which is known as the Western European tradition, albeit it is a construction, after all, that has been created through the iterative process of academia, which is a pale, male and stale thing. Although less and less, I hear. But, you know, even for me, who can't really give a shit about the whole white male thing, I can definitely still feel the stale in a lot of academic practice in general. It is not necessarily a career that I would pursue, although there are moments in my life where I do kind of idealize that type of life as well. The life of contemplation, a sort of secular monk. And that is in many ways what philosophers end up being, and kind of what Heidegger was as well. A search for a pure life. And it makes sense for it to blossom in this time in history, because the time of the world wars is the time when mass media really permeates all of society in Europe. and creates the fundaments of what we today experience as the modern culture or the contemporary culture. And so this extremely intellectually intense attempt at re-anchoring concepts so far down the line of philosophical development is in many ways linked to the many other revolutionizing initiatives that were undertaken in that century, be they whatever color, in terms of political ideologies, art movements, societal transformation, music, etc., etc. It is explosively modern, almost as if it's trying to explode you out of the juggernaut that is this construction, Western philosophy. It is trying to explode you out from within. Hence, Being and Time, which is the seminal work of Heidegger, has become known for being incredibly dense reading, which is another paradoxical aspect of him and his thinking, because in many ways what phenomenology is trying to do is extremely pure, distilled, and simple, but the vocabulary needed to do it is often extremely advanced, and Heidegger himself has to essentially create a implied frame of reference with the viewer, where his own made-up German terms become integral concepts to his whole philosophical model, which begins from a general critique of all philosophical modeling up to that point in history, and then proposes a different model which is still encumbered by the fact that it is a model, a construction. And this is linked to the second word in the title of the book, time. Constructions have that characteristic of being frozen in time. This is essential in Heidegger's critique of preceding philosophy, especially his explosive criticism of the legacy of René Descartes. He picks apart René Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, by highlighting that there is an unanswered question lurking beneath the surface of even that axiom, which is, what does it mean for you to be anything? The meaning of the word being is never clarified or even defined, but for the sentence cogito ergo sum to make sense, it has to be understood. And so what Heidegger points out is that a lot of philosophers, in their capricious wish to present a new model to the grand tradition of models of thoughts, of heuristic patterns, of defining paradigms, they often leave out the most fundamental questions, taking them for granted. Well, as Heidegger points out, if that work hasn't been done, then all the secondary work can really be taken with a grain of salt, or just disregarded altogether. if we do not understand what being is, then we cannot begin to have the discussion about what is and what isn't. Because, as both analytic and continental philosophers will agree, natural language has that pesky habit of treating existent things and non-existent things the same, i.e., it is always possible to talk about something. And this is linked to why discourse becomes a problem altogether. Why do we have intellectual discussions? Is it simply to amuse ourselves, to masturbate our own intellects? Or is it to solve concrete tasks in our environment and to evolve? The history of humanity shows that there's been a lot of both taking place. Critics of the contemporary time will often be very quick to point out people who seem to be merely just intellectual wankers who enjoy to name drop things at dinner parties. But forget that with every invention and solution to a problem of human adaptation to its environment, there has been a preceding line of reasoning, which will have had to be hashed out all the way back to the Stone Age, where Fred Flintstone would have used some primitive grunts to signal to his mate that there's a nearby boar. All the way up to board meetings surrounding the marketing strategy for the next multinational tech platform company. So Heidegger is quite the linguist, and this is parallel to what I was mentioning earlier about his anchoring in Greek philosophy, because he employs the linguistic analysis of ancient Greek terminology from the very first philosophical writings that we've been able to preserve within the Western canon, and tries to interpret their meaning in a way that allows us to understand it more clearly. That is, he wishes to describe words without introducing new words. And so, for instance, when he deals with the word logos, which has become a very popular term in contemporary pop psychology and philosophy, he translates that as letting something be seen. And he does this from the ancient Greek terminology. The origins of the words. He's using the etymology of philosophical terminology to describe the concepts more clearly. It allows you to take an abstract concept, logos, and describe it in a way that allows you to associate it with a given thing, letting something be seen. Instead of memorizing a set of new vocal sounds, you're allowing yourself to have associations awakened within you through the descriptions provided by your partner in a discussion. You know, that's the discussion is the fundament of all intellectual tradition. And if a discussion is being had in earnest, then there surely must be some stakes involved, which means that there is a sense of urgency to find meaning in the conversation, often so that this can precede the act of doing. And Heidegger points out that his reasoning behind undertaking the project of criticizing Cartesian ontology and replacing it with his own is precisely that if we don't contend with the question of the meaning of being, then we won't be able to produce intellectual discourse that translates from theory to practice. And this is why I find this book so important, because that is a criticism of contemporary philosophy. It has slidden out to the periphery into becoming an endless discussion about theory, which is so far removed from any idea of praxis that you would struggle to even think of any application of a lot of the concepts being created through modern philosophy. Modern academic practice within the field of philosophy. And so, what is the meaning of being? Time. Being and time. The whole book is summarized in those two words. Yet it is known for being one of the most complex philosophical works ever written. It attempts to describe a concept so obvious that it almost annoys the general person. But it attempts to describe it in such an earnest way that it devotes itself completely to the beautiful paradox of becoming almost impenetrably complex. But perhaps that is my over-romanticized poetic interpretation of the phenomenon that is being in time. But I'm fond of it, and that is why I'm talking about it on the podcast. Facts. The meaning of being is time. Now, it's not a simple thing to say necessarily. It's not an easy thing to understand what time is either. We all learn how to read the clock, and we all learn something about the sun passing over the sky over the course of a day. But what exactly constitutes a moment? That is almost impossible to talk about. When does a moment start and when does a moment end? Sure, you can measure someone's 100-meter sprint, but even that you can see how much scaffolding of preconceived intellectual concepts you need in order to have that clear certainty of hitting the stopwatch button and ending the moment. But then again, the way humans see the world, the moment continues after the stopwatch is hit for the runner. Which brings us to this idea of subjectivity and why Heideggerian phenomenology has lent itself to this use for innovations, so to speak, within subjectivist thinking, such as the contemporary critical tradition, like intersectionality and things like this, lived experiences, which is so fun to discuss in controversial debates on the internet. You know, phenomenology very much lends itself to this idea of the primacy of the lived experience. But it still claims that there is a possibility of vocabulary that is something approximating objective. And that there is a distinction between authenticity and inauthenticity in all kinds of being, which is not necessarily something that the descendants of Heideggerian thought would agree with. This dichotomy of authenticity is very often a sort of like side distinguishing philosophical point between the woke left and the based red pill, or something like that. Something like that. The based red pill. But nevertheless, phenomenology, importantly, is separated from general science, physical science, in that it doesn't deal with the start and the end of the world as a part of a narrative, such as the astronomical narrative. It simply describes what you see with your eyes and what you feel with your emotions. And so, in that sense, there is, again, you can notice the drive towards a higher purity, which phenomenology hopes to achieve. And the fundamental idea of this understanding of the world is that we cannot separate the world from the things within it. And so in comes the idea of people and their environments, and identity. How a person's life is shaped by their identity is very often much more important in the way that they choose to think, rather than some logical discussion of what ought to be. And so when Heidegger chooses to describe the world through starting with the human being and then working out to the objects in the surrounding world of the human being, he is being so radically subjective that he almost approximates something like objectivity, because he steps outside of all of the sciences and tries to speak purely about life itself as a unified thing. Pretty big sandwich to bite over, if you ask me. That's part one. In part two, we're going to read some excerpts and talk about them. Hope you enjoy. See you in part two.